Good evening, everyone, and welcome. And those of you who are still trickling in, you're going to see a poll pop up on the screen. I'm going to get started here in just like 30 seconds, but if you see that poll, just fill that out and we'll get going here in just a moment. All right, we're going to have some more people coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started because I've got a lot I want to get through and I want to leave some time for questions at the end. My name's Tal Kitron. I've worked with Alparuth for over 10 years, mostly as a SAT, ACT, PSAT tutor, more recently as an executive function coach. And we're here today to talk about learning differences, including ADHD, twice exceptional, dyslexia, and others. And just give some thoughts on my experience with students with LDs and talk a bit about how to support these students the best way possible. As we go, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. And like I said, my aim is to save some time at the very end for questions. I anticipate the presentation taking probably about 45 minutes, maybe 50, and then we'll have at least 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Our goals today, we're going to identify some of the common learning differences, some of which I already mentioned. We'll discuss common accommodations for students with LDs, both in terms of school and then as that relates to testing, generally very related. And then just talk about some strategies we can use in your own home. So whether you're a student or a parent or a teacher, these are things that just can help and make a big difference. Before we get into it, let's talk through some of these definitions. So ADD and ADHD, probably the most common LD students I work with. ADHD, recent stats say affect 8.4% of children. There's some differential brain development, delays in maturation of the brain, and generally students with ADHD have challenges with executive functioning, which we will talk about more, and then regulating attention and inhibition. So sometimes impulse control is hard, right? As you know, kind of the classic ADHD is lack of focus, right? And so a lot of that just comes with lack of executive function skills. And those can be developed and honed. ADHD is differentiated from ADD inattentive, which is really the more classic lack of focus. And those students have to just really work harder, exert a ton more energy to inhibit those impulses and to really have focus. Then you've got ADHD hyperactive, kind of self-explanatory, and ADHD combined, which is a bit of a combination of those second and third bullets. So what makes the ADHD brain different? A lot of it is about the frontal cortex. If we have executive function skills, maybe like in a lower level than some of our peers, a lot of times that's because of just attention, EF, organization, all things controlled by that frontal cortex. We've also got the system that regulates emotions and attention, differences in the basal ganglia, and then reticular activating system. So, right, seeing and then kind of interpreting what you see into thoughts and actions. All of this results in lack of focus, so inattention, impulsivity, and or hyperactivity. Staying technical again for just a little while, some of the main culprits of ADHD and ADD, norepinephrine, which comes from dopamine, something that most people are familiar with, something in the brain that makes us feel good. Norepinephrine transmits nerve signals, which increase alertness, arousal, our attention, and affect our sleep cycle and our mood. If you have a deficiency of dopamine, then it's very, very hard to regulate and to pay attention to something, especially if you find it boring. Whereas even if you have low dopamine, a lot of times that results in hyper focus if it's something that really is brings you pleasure, whether that's a video game or maybe a sporting event or something else. Because of that, there's been an argument for ADHD as more of like a dysregulation than a deficit of attention. And I just think that's a better way to put it, honestly, because it's not necessarily the fact that we don't have the attention, it's just that we attend to things differently. There are a lot of co-occurring neurodiversity diagnoses. So generally students with ADHD, a lot of them, almost half, will also have a diagnosed learning difference or disability. For dyslexia, it's similar numbers. 25 to 40% of children with dyslexia also have ADHD. And then the other way around, 25% of children with ADHD have some form of dyslexia. And then autism spectrum disorder and ADHD are also very much related. They coexist in a lot of people. So I mentioned these, and we're going to come back to this later as well, but executive function skills are in a spectrum. We all have them. And what EF coaches do is they help people develop these skills. So for example, if a student is a junior in high school and it's AP season and we're just having trouble starting off our studying or planning our schedule or prioritizing which tests to start with and end with. So in getting to know a student, usually through like 30-minute sessions, right, once or twice a week, and then kind of spacing that out, we'll kind of get a sense of, all right, so where are we struggling? Is it task initiation? Is it task persistence or just completion? Or is it as simple as most students are just not able to stay on task, right? So like they've got too many distractions. So the inhibition part is something we need to develop, and self-regulation and self-monitoring. Others are amazing at that part, but they're not good at planning or managing their time. So they don't set aside enough time to do what they need. And the three pillars of EF skills are working memory, cognitive flexibility, and self-control. And again, we all have these skills in a spectrum, and just because we are lacking in a certain EF area doesn't mean that can't improve, right? We improve even as adults and improve naturally without any coaching, but sometimes extra help can push people along and really help them think about the way they're thinking. So metacognition. Going to talk a little bit about dyslexia. It is generally characterized by difficulties with word recognition and often spelling and abilities to decode, which you see a definition of at the bottom. So kind of seeing a word and then not knowing exactly what it means, right? Sometimes it's because the letters are flipped or just we have some sort of little bit of a processing delay. It's often auditory related, and sometimes it's just visual. And the theme with all these students with LDs, the students I've worked with, which is hundreds and hundreds over the years, is most of them, by the time I see them, so sophomores, juniors in high school, have developed some sort of strategy, right? So they know that reading comprehension is not their strong suit, but they've now got some sort of tip or trick that helps them get through it. Students with dyslexia, though, often are not big readers for obvious reasons. So that can impede their vocabulary growth and background knowledge, which then sometimes when you get to like SAT, ACT time, that can hurt us. And then third big one we're going to talk about today is 2E, or twice exceptional. These are students who are gifted and also have a diagnosed LD. So generally students who are high achieving in the sense that they have very good grades, right? Or great test takers, right? Just clearly gifted. But then that's in combination with ADHD or dyslexia or other emotional behavioral disorders. And so with this, I think a lot of it, and a lot of this is true with ADHD as well, and anyone who is lacking in EF skills, executive functioning, what you see, what the teacher sees, what the parent sees, and what's the reality, like they may all just be totally different. So a teacher may see, hey, this student's really bright, very interested in STEM, uh, amazingly able to solve problems and understand what we're talking about. However, once we get to the verbal, the teacher notices maybe this 2E student is not having the easiest time with reading and writing. Uh, and then like that manifests in homework completion, right, or assigned reading not being done. Then the parent is seeing kind of the behind the scenes. Every night, homework's a struggle, right? And that's probably going to be especially for the verbal stuff. It seems like other students are doing stuff pretty fast. They're doing 30 minutes or an hour, but it's taking my student many hours. Often this will be a lack of organization, right? So if you see the backpack in the room is a mess, that can be just, I don't know, a bit of a clue. And then deep interest in subjects outside of school, which is, I think, an absolute positive. Can engage for hours in topics we care about, but maybe not the ones we don't. And a lot of times, low motivation, or I guess I should say, low executive function skills, or like let's say, we're gifted, but we're struggling with the verbal. It can be really frustrating for students, and it can result in what seems like a lack of motivation. And so the student becomes withdrawn, she hates school. But what's actually happening is she just doesn't feel confident. And so she hates it because she feels like she's not as good as she could be. And really, you give a couple successes, a couple little wins that can build the motivation and really change things. Just a few other LDs, and then we're going to just talk through some strategies and things we can do to help, things I've learned through work with students and just my time with Appleleaf. Other things we will see, so memory or retrieval issues. Some people just don't have amazing working memory, which is short-term memory. And others are great in the short term, but then if we go a month or so, it will have leaked out and we've forgotten. And to be honest, many students have that issue where like we learn something, but then we've packed a whole bunch in, so it's easy to forget. I've had several students with auditory processing issues, and it's really interesting, right? Many of them are very visual learners by design. Versus if we have visual processing issues, and this is cool too, some students are really good just listening, right? And you could say it to them and it clicks much more clearly than if you wrote it on screen. That's pretty rare. And then dyscalculia, you can see a little example of that on the right-hand side. It has to do with math. Dyspraxia is a neurological disorder that's more about motor functions. And so kind of thoughts not lining up with motor functions. And so all these are just things that we see occasionally, and it's important not to assume just because a student learns differently that it's, oh, this is ADHD, or oh, this is dyslexia. It may be something kind of slightly different. Let's talk accommodations, super important, especially when it comes to like we're getting into the last couple of years of high school and we have to do college entrance exams. Before you even get into that, you need to have the right accommodations in school, right? Extra time is often the first accommodation that is granted, like time and a half for tests. That can be like honestly crucial for most students with LDs because an hour in a test isn't enough to show what they know, right? We take a little bit longer to process and a little bit longer to start writing. Maybe an hour and a half is enough. You can write a couple more paragraphs and really show off your skills. And then this is also not just in school. So the ADA includes LDs as conditions for jobs, right? So as you get summer jobs and right as you become a member of the workforce, you also are entitled to accommodations, right? LDs are really learning differences, but also considered disabilities. So this is not just an in-school thing. Evaluations are often where it starts. The important thing for this in my world is that if a student doesn't have accommodations in school and hasn't had them for a while, they're very unlikely to get accommodations on the SAT or ACT. And so then all of a sudden, like we know, our student can't do or it struggles with time crunches and isn't going to be able to finish everything. But if we haven't had a 504 or an IEP plan in place in school, the ACT and SAT generally will not grant accommodations. As far as evaluations we see, so psychological evaluation, usually just intended to guide the diagnosis and treatment from a medical perspective. Then you've got psychoeducational evaluations, which are more related to education, learning style, and that's a lot like executive functioning, thinking about the way we think. We're late on assignments. Why? What can we do differently? Right? So asking those kind of questions and then recommending a treatment. And then neuropsych evaluations. So again, focused on why, but more just about how our brain is working, right? So are we producing the correct amount of everything? And is there anything that we can kind of see based on the neuropsych that tells us why these difficulties may be happening? And so, as I mentioned, you must have evidence that you receive school-based accommodations if you want it on the ACT, SAT. The school-based official accommodation plans, that's more of a private school thing. The more common things we see by far are the IEPs and the 504s, right? And many students, I mean, if you have a learning difference, you are already probably familiar with this. The hard part is getting the teachers to actually enforce it properly. Some schools and some teachers are great, and others, either because usually it's not they don't care, they're often overwhelmed or it's too much or they're not aware. So you may have to advocate more to get your IEP or 504 plan, I guess, implemented properly. The ADD and ADHD accommodations we see, I mean, the default is going to be extended time on tests, which is usually time and a half, like I said. Instruction and assignments tailored to the student, so maybe a little bit of extra special attention or sitting at the front of the class is one we see a lot, right? Because if you sit at the back, for most students, that's not ideal. But for a student with ADD, that could really be the kiss of death. It's like, I really can't pay attention when I'm in the back. I need to be up front. A lot of positive reinforcement. So I'm very big on this, both in tutoring and coaching. Every little thing can be a win. Even if it's just, well, I didn't finish my assignment, but I did clean up my room and my backpack, and I've kind of got step one. That's a win. That's going to set you up for success later, right? Or maybe, yeah, well, I installed this app to help me with my calendar, right? Like I would praise that to no end, and just if a student sees little wins along the way, it's going to be hugely beneficial and motivating. We'll talk more about assistive technology. I mean, you can even use AI these days. I haven't got into that very much, but you can. Allowing extra breaks or time to move around. So you'll see that on SAT, ACT sometimes, frequent breaks. And then environment with limited distraction. So that'll be honestly in school hard to accommodate, but sometimes it's a matter of like, okay, you get time and a half, but also you can take the test on your own, right? So that would be a classic part of a 504 IEP plan. And same with extra assistance and staying organized, right? So like just if a teacher is great and really has the time and energy, they will help your student with all this stuff. This is also what I think parents to a certain extent can help with if it doesn't fall on deaf ears, which at this age sometimes it does. And of course, coaching can help too. For dyslexia, the umbrella accommodation is extended time. And I see much more often double time than I do for ADD or ADHD, right? So if it's a pretty severe dyslexia, you might get double or even triple time. That extended time, I should mention back here as well, it's a blessing and a curse, right? If like, for example, you have ADD inattentive and your problem is focusing, well, being there for 5 hours rather than 3 is not going to help you focus more. So a lot of what we have to work on is how do we use those extra breaks, replenish your brain stores, right? And just kind of roll your neck, rest your brain, stretch your legs, and then come back with more energy. Easier said than done, but a lot of this is the art of using breaks properly. And then again, for dyslexia, almost more than any of the other LDs, I really trust my students a lot just about what has worked and what hasn't. because the classic, all right, I'm going to read, I'm going to take some notes, I'm going to go and do the questions will probably not work. And every student is different. So it's not just like all dyslexia, all people who have dyslexia are the same by any means at all. Most of them have come up with some sort of cool way to get through it and really understand what they're reading. Where we can help with tutoring is little tools, right? So like maybe it's just about eliminating answers rather than going to the best one, or bookending by reading the beginning and end of a paragraph, not the whole thing, right? That'll save time and energy. Some other accommodations we'll see for dyslexia. So like in class, you'll get verbal instructions and repetition. I've seen on tests larger Scantron sheets or Scantrons that you don't have to bubble in. You can just kind of make a mark. And then other visual prompts or cues. Mentioned the test sheet assistive technology like an audio recorder. So being able to record the teacher and then listening it back later. That's an accommodation I've seen a few times. And then the setting in which we're learning. So maybe you have an accommodation to be in an individual learning environment or a small group. And again, like I said, maybe going up to the front of the class and always having a seat at the front. I think that all of these are really designed the right way. But again, what I've seen working in the public school system is like, and I'm very conscientious, but even for me, it was hard. It was hard to keep track of all the people who had LDs and what their different accommodations were. And the ones who were the most proactive, or their parents were, and who told me, hey, this isn't working, or hey, can we do this? That worked better. I think that it's very hard to assume that the teacher is going to do a good job if you don't prod them a little bit. So we got to know what works and then really advocate for it. And then timing. So more breaks, different order of things, and then extended time. So what can we do? What can we do to help our kids with LDs? Number one is building frustration tolerance and really a positive mindset. Positive visualization is key. Making mistakes can also be just emphasized as good, important, perfect. We need to make mistakes, right? We can, like, as a teacher, sometimes I will, usually it's an accident, but sometimes I'll purposely make a mistake to show, okay, here's how we can bounce back from that, right? Oh, embarrassing, but really not that much. Next time, what I should have done, or what could I have done differently? So coming from a lens of curiosity, I think is very important, but making mistakes and learning from them. That is the best way that we learn. So that frustration tolerance can be hard because some students really don't like to miss questions or just make mistakes, but I would say it's absolutely crucial. And we can model those coping strategies for our kids or our students. This is another one where a lot of students have kind of already developed, like, okay, so I know that I have ADHD, I learn differently. This is what works for me, right? I know I have auditory processing issues, so I'm a visual person. So these are some questions you can ask, though, to get yourself kind of down this road or help the student. Let's see, I'm struggling with reading, but when I listen, I really am good. So maybe we can get audiobooks, right? If there are tools that will help us with that, let's do it. Most of us, like 99%, are not multitaskers. We are monotaskers, but if there's noise that's distracting and music helps you zone in while doing your homework, honor that, make space for that, right? So maybe it's not headphones, maybe it's just a little background, or maybe it has to be headphones. I don't know, right? So you got to try these things and see what works and what doesn't. If it's fidgety and we need to throw a ball against the wall to help us study or focus, we got to do that somewhere where it's not going to drive everyone else up against the up the proverbial wall, I should say. So if you need to do something like that, okay, but let's figure out how. Can we throw it up in the air so it's not making noise? Can we find a ball that's very light and not going to make bouncing sounds or thumping against the wall or floor, right? Or just maybe we need to change where we're working. Work with how you are designed. Don't fight yourself. You got to lean into, okay, this is really what I like and what works, and this is what doesn't. And it can be really hard to figure that out, but sometimes with prompting, students can really make big leaps on just understanding themselves. here's one where I think the use of the term bunny ears here is a little bit insulting because actually this is loop, swoop, and pull. Uh, but bunny ears, which is the way I tie my shoes, is actually different. In any case, I probably could have been helped by this when I was younger because loop, swoop, and pull never stuck for me. Maybe if someone had said, okay, fold each end of one lace into one bunny ear, hold it with your thumb and forefinger, so like they could demonstrate that for me, cross the ears so they form the X, and then loop it through. Maybe this is bunny ears. The key is there is no step that's small enough. Break it down into the smallest steps possible, praise every individual win, and make sure we review the steps to understand. Because some students, if I just say tie your shoes, duh. And others, maybe we have an LD and tie my shoe is not an easy thing to do. It's not like you can assume, boom, got it. So what is rote and obvious to some will not be the case for many students with LDs. And you just break it down into impossibly simple steps. Hey, your backpack's disorganized? Okay, let's start by dumping it out. Let's look at every single item and let's talk about what's in it. Don't just say, all right, take out what you don't need. That's not going to be good enough, right? We need to really kind of walk through it and break it down. This is one of my favorite slides and maybe the most important because I think that this is the key to helping students with LDs in a healthy way. It's dialogue, it's inquiry, it's curiosity. So if a student is saying, well, I just on tests, like, I don't know what happens. I zone out and like, that's why I got a bad grade. It's really hard to understand what that means from a third person perspective. So I'd be like, okay, well, can you describe that a little bit more? What's a time or feeling in the past that this has happened? Anything that you remember doing that worked to get you unstuck? Or if not, what could we maybe do differently? What do you think it was about this passage that we don't like? Is it the language? Is it how long it was? Is it the answer choices or combination? If this happens again, what can we do differently? How can we move past it? Right. So it's building frustration tolerance and it's thinking about this lens of curiosity. We need to be strategic. We need to solve this problem. And it's just a problem to solve, right? It's not a monumental hurdle that we'll never cross, right? So move from that frustration to let's analyze it and then put it into action, no matter how small that action step may be to begin with. Assistive technology, as I mentioned, can be super helpful. So, I mean, in law school, I remember the first day I walked into class, I heard like a pitter patter, and I was like, "Is it raining inside? Like, what's happening?" And it was everyone just typing on their laptops. Some high schools have already moved to that, but maybe just note taking by hand is not an option. Maybe we need printed notes from the teacher, and that could be an accommodation that, if it's available, would be really helpful. We mentioned audio recordings or even video recordings, especially if it's a Zoom session, right? Take a look and then you can kind of break it down and watch parts of it as needed. And then e-readers and productivity apps, so apps that help you block certain well-worn paths, like an app that that you just kind of always go to, or certain website blockers or screen time limiters. It tends to be the case that if a student is, no matter whether they have an LD or not, if they're like, the number one thing that I see is we got to put the phone aside. So like when we're doing work, we're working, and when we're not working, we're not working. Healthy boundaries between work and play, and making sure when you are studying, when you are working, your phone is not accessible, right? At least not for anything other than essentials. And these assistive technologies, I mean, there's a huge variety. I've probably only scraped the surface here, but like there's so many and they're so accessible for studying, for writing, for organization, for reading. Of all of these things, I would say the organization part is probably the first place to start and most important for most people. Like if you don't have a calendar on your phone, I don't know how you could operate. I don't know how you can keep all that in your brain in high school and remember, here's when I have this due and here's when I have that due. And most don't. A lot of my students just realize the week of or the day before, oh no, I've got this due. Um, you can see this app wheel and a link to that. And so it's a wheel of just kind of looking at, okay, so what do I need to do? Do I need to translate text to speech, right? Do I just need a digital storage app, right? And so you can kind of see all these different options. And I have only tried a few of them, but I have definitely had students who have had success with a lot of these. Other than the actual educational aspect, a lot of times there's a social and emotional part to this. So like when you see a student becoming withdrawn because they feel like they're not having success, right? That will have a social and emotional effect. So when we think about how we're thinking, that includes thinking about emotions. So when I'm stuck on a test and I have that kind of brain drain moment, what am I feeling? Am I feeling panicked? Am I feeling like, oh no, here we go again? Am I blank? So we kind of got to think back about that and say, okay, so close your eyes, put yourself in where you were on test day and tell me how this felt. And then listening to your body. I mean, body scans, making sure that you're taking care of basic needs, right? This is when we're this week, we've had a stressful week where my wife's been in and out of the hospital. And so I have to think about that too. It's like, oh, am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Have I walked the dog? Have I been outside? But just taking care of yourself, because a lot of times, like if you are hangry or if you are overtired, then some of these things will compound. We can be just a little bit more emotional, right? And sometimes that's not what we want. So our goal is let's build resilience. We think about that feeling we had on test day and we're like recognizing it then next time when it happens. It doesn't have to be, oh, this is a good thing every time you feel it, but it's like, okay, well, this is good. I recognize what's happening. That's the positive. I understand how I am feeling in this moment. That is step one to then correcting it or doing something to help yourself, right? That's the action plan. And then remember that negative emotions are inevitable and okay sometimes, right? And uncertainty is okay. Like it is a very good thing in this day and age for someone to say, I don't know, rather than trying to fudge an answer, both in school and then just in the working world. Like as adults, you see that a lot too. People are overly confident when they don't need to be. I'd much prefer they just say, I'm not sure, right? Let me look it up and I'll get back to you. And giving yourself permission to be sad about a result or frustrated that you don't learn the same as your best friend, right? Or that it feels like it comes more easily to them. That could be really hard and really sad and really frustrating and angering. And so we need to have space to grieve and have those frustrations, right? That's okay too. Moving into ADHD a little bit more and just how to help those students, because again, this is the most common LD that I've seen with test prep generally. And I will say again that I can't say enough, the timing, like the extra time on a test for a student with ADD or ADHD is an absolute blessing and a curse. We need the time to finish the test, but by hour 3 or 4 of being in an ACT or SAT room, we are often not productive. We're looking outside, we're ready to go. How do we preserve mental stamina and energy to get to the end of the test, without burning out? So, I mean, one thing generally with ADD is trying to focus on the positives, which there are plenty, right? The hyper focus, if you really need to get something done, can be a great quality, right? If you really need to zone in and when you have to, you have to, that's great. You can do it better than most. And then just knowing that like everything in life has the good and the bad, right? So ADD, it's a LD, it's different. It's sometimes going to cause frustration or make us not do things as quickly as we would like, but it is something we can work with. It doesn't need to be a disaster at all, and really isn't. Fidget spinners were huge a while back. Not sure if they're still as popular, but I think a lot of teachers and parents, when they see people fidgeting, they think, oh, this person isn't focused. The opposite may be true, right? So some students really need that little bit of motion. They need that release. And so they need the fidget spinner to be paying attention. I find that getting up and moving around, So what I say when we take a break in a session is go ahead and stretch your legs, rest your brain, and let's come back. We'll talk a bit more about what are good ways to replenish those stores of memory or just brain energy. And then some students absolutely will benefit from moving the pencil as they go. So active reading, it might just be enough we don't have to actually annotate in the sense of analyzing, but just write little notes. And then you can see your own words, and maybe just that little difference in having it written down can help a ton. The thing we don't want to do is say, stop moving, stop fidgeting, don't inhibit the impulse to move, because that's going to just drain our cognitive capacity unproductively, unnecessarily. So let the body move. If you're a fidgeter, you want to do that, right, within reason, and that will help you actually free up mental resources for what you need to work on or focus on. Right, so fidgeting, not a bad thing. One common technique is Pomodoro. That would be take 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. For a student with ADHD, I would definitely do a smaller amount of work time and maybe longer breaks. The danger with a 20-minute break is if you get sunk into something, right? So if you have issues with time management or prioritization, or if I have 20 minutes, I'm going to get on my phone and I'm going to go on Reddit or Snapchat or Discord or whatever it is, or do gaming. If you know that's something that will happen and it will take longer than 20 minutes, it's not a good thing to do in a break. Right? So instead it would be, I'm going to work for 15 minutes and I'm going to go outside, get maybe a snack, do some neck rolls and stretch, and then come back and work. Right? But maybe the work and the break, maybe both have to be non-phone related for some. And then I'm very big on not doing the same thing for hours and hours, or even more than about 20 minutes. I'll want to change from verbal to math to writing to something else. Or if it's ACT, we're not going to spend the whole section on reading or English. We're going to work in math and science. And it won't just be practice questions. It'll be some instruction and then some practice and maybe a time drill. If you switch stuff up, it's like a little reboot, right? If you keep just going on, students are going to lose energy and focus. So I try to see that in my students' eyes. Like if it's a test prep session and we're 20, 25 minutes in, and I can just see like the last couple of questions were hard, there's some frustration. It's like, all right, let's take a few minutes of a break. Let's come back and do something different. It works like a charm every time. It's also a good tool as a teacher or parent is to kind of dangle that carrot of a break. All right, just work for 25 more minutes and then you got your break, right? It's simple, but it's effective. I mentioned breaking things up. Like there is no task that is like no task that can't be broken up into smaller parts, even if it seems obvious. So if a student's intimidated because, well, their job is to do all of unit 1, let's figure out what does that mean. So unit 1 consists of 4 chapters. Each chapter has 10 questions. Which chapter are you most confused on or most worried about? Are there any that you're confident in, right? So that helps you plan it. Same with large projects. Don't wait till the end. Procrastination is so common. I'm guilty, as are many. But if you break it up, it'll help with the task initiation. And I see that as a big problem. Students, once they get started, they're golden. But they have something that blocks them from starting the task until they feel like, oh, I'm really up against the wall here. I've got to do it now. And then small goals, small wins, short time limits, right? If you work for 20 minutes, that's better than doing nothing. Even 2 minutes is better than no minutes, right? So every little bit helps, and just kind of building that positive learning environment. Mentioned breaks. I'd say it's absolutely crucial for everyone, but especially students with LDs. Active breaks are best. And if you go outside is honestly the absolute best, if weather permitting. Studies show that even looking at a picture of nature is helpful and can relax people and kind of help replenish some of those glucose stores. Again, though, just making sure that you're not going into something that's going to take longer than your 10-minute break or longer than your 15-minute planned break. Right. So you can chat with a friend, you can talk with your parent, you can uh, talk to a neighbor, right? But you don't want to get into something that's going to really distract you or disrupt you. On that note, distractions aren't the worst thing. So we can be distracted. We just don't want to be totally disrupted off our course. For example, if we're talking about, like, if I notice we're working through a question, but a student's clearly got something on their mind, what we want is we want them to have a pad of paper or something close by so they can write it down, right? I certainly have that. So it's like, okay, I want to make sure I mention this later or write it down after my session. Let me put it here and hope I don't forget. And if I really don't want to forget, I'll put it in my phone calendar. If a student has that kind of thing in the back of their head where it's like, ah, oh, shoot, I really don't want to forget this, they won't be able to pay attention to you. So it is important to pause and either let them ask the question or at least write it down for later. All right, home stretch here. Students with executive functioning deficits honestly includes most everyone because, like I said, these are in a spectrum. So you remember these skills. Student might be amazing at goal setting, but the follow through is not great. They might be amazing at inhibiting impulses, but they're not planning well enough to get things done in time. So again, I think something that I've learned is don't start with a bunch of things, break everything down, go slowly, point by point, setting goals. And I don't want to be the guru as a coach at all. I want to just say, okay, well, I'm going to give you all the tools to do to achieve your goals, right? To set them and achieve them. We can help them build a to-do list with the right apps and the right kind of goals. And I'd say I will talk about Google Calendar, but that's the number one that everyone should probably have, some sort of calendar app. Generally, EF sessions are about 30 minutes long. So maybe we work for 20, 25 minutes because we'll do like 15 minutes, short break, and the last 10, right? Just a short mental break to show, hey, this helps, right? You can get up, move around, and it will help you focus back when you get back. And then it's very good to have a homework book. I would actually flesh that out much more. So like asking the student, where does your homework live? How do you have it broken up per subject? Within AP US history, do you have it broken up by color, or like how do you differentiate between an assignment and that's reading or an actual paper that's due? Like we really want to make that very clear so that that's not something you're thinking about, right? All your information can be in one place, but separate it out nicely. And again, if our goal is self-efficacy, you better maintain a positive attitude, right? Whether this is parents with students, especially probably, because again, at this age, just like it might be a lot better coming from a teacher or a peer than it is from a parent. Sometimes that's just how it is. But every piece of progress we praise. That's motivation and can help ward off frustration of the perceived failures. A lot of times EF issues present as students who are unmotivated or hard on themselves to begin with. So if we give them those successes, that will breed confidence and we'll be more confident. We'll try different things. We'll repeat this new thing, right? And just new challenges. Mentioned Google Calendar for good for short term, but also long term projects. So if like your final exam schedule already, put that in, but also schedule breaks. If you don't schedule them, you won't take them, at least not properly. Healthy boundaries between work and play means you want to schedule maybe like from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. we're exercising, right? Or we're doing something fun, right? Schedule lunch if you're so busy that you're going to forget otherwise or not have time, right? So taking care of yourself is important too. And then dyslexia again. So just a few tools for how to help. I mentioned trusting them, like couldn't be more crucial. There are definitely some digital books that have built-in accommodations like bigger fonts. And honestly, the new digital SAT does a pretty good job of this, where there's some more accommodation than there used to be. And there's no more Scantron sheet, which is nice for students with dyslexia. Text to speech can also help students. I've had a few students who benefited from that a lot. Written documentation. So like if there's a neuropsych report, generally most reports will have some sort of recommendation. Absolutely good to look at as a coach, but also as a teacher or a parent. Very helpful. And even as a student, right? Just go, like as the person who has this report, go look. You don't have to agree with all of it, but I think it's an important document. And then I've actually seen a lot where my students with dyslexia are weaker in math. They're like, this is so weird, isn't it, that I'm dyslexic, but I feel like math is way harder for me. And honestly, because they've often developed this cool way of doing the reading, I see it a lot, especially with word problems. So like math word problems tend to be the absolute hardest thing for my dyslexic students, because it's like, I thought I was supposed to do math, but even just setting this up and understanding the equation of what I'm solving for is so hard. And I mean, every student's different, but especially with LDs, one size does not fit all. You just have to be patient and kind of understanding and really learn about how that student is. And it won't even be consistent within like a student's, like one student might be different from day to day, right? You'll see patterns though. Some students are going to be really slow, right? Dyslexic students will carefully read every single word. I see much more common actually the bottom bullet point. Active reading, right? Engaging. So passive reading is this, then this, and then that comes to that, and that's no good. Active reading, we're marking it up, we're taking little simple notes, underlining, circling, starring, that kind of thing, and bookending, right? And reading the questions and choices first tend to be all tools that dyslexic students make good use of. And then that middle point, mnemonic devices or little rhymes or songs. That's why you have to trust the student, because that won't be something that other people use, but it might work for them. And here's an example of what like the annotates could look like. And it could be super different for other people, but this person has circled words that are repeated and then thought about like, what does that mean? Right. This is actually real, AP lit, AP laying like annotation. Whereas on an ACT or SAT, we probably wouldn't want to get into such detail. But just putting in your own words and writing it down can make a huge difference and just help understanding a ton. And when you're at the questions that are related, you go back, you can look at your words rather than the underlined stuff and the types of words that are harder to maybe interpret. For classes with long reading passages or chapters, that can be really intimidating for students with dyslexia, but also ADHD as well. So like one thing to do is if there's other distracting content, whether it's notes on the side or pictures, cover them, right? And just kind of like move your paper down as you go. Cross out unnecessary information. Maybe that's just like a bunch of words between the subject and the verb. If you cross that out, it becomes clearer. You could pull out and annotate on the sides like we saw on the last slide, and then maybe bracketing, bookending the first and last sentence of the paragraph to remind yourself what the main idea is. That physical engagement is huge, seems to help a lot of students with dyslexia, and many of them are already doing it. Some of them have a sense of, here are some things that have definitely worked and don't work for me, and that's where we can kind of jump in and help hone those skills. And again, like I can't say enough that students with LDs, I always learn something cool because we think differently. And so we've had to kind of just figure out a different brain pattern to solve certain questions, right? Or attack certain parts of life. Books like The Dyslexic Advantage by Brock and Fernette Eid are great. They take some just a look at the benefits. And so for people with dyslexia, it can be good to just see it as a positive in certain ways, because I think it absolutely is. We see a lot of memory and retrieval issues throughout students with LDs, but particularly dyslexia. So you want to limit the amount of information. I'd like to start by reviewing stuff from last time. We introduce a couple of things, but then we're just going to work through that. Not going to introduce a bunch of topics because that will be overwhelming and unproductive. Shorter sessions are generally better. So an EF coaching session would probably be 30 minutes. A tutoring session is usually 90 minutes, but maybe I would do 1 hour for a student with LDs, right? And make sure we take a little break in the middle, right? And we just got to find the comfort zone. Before introducing something new, like if I'm going to talk about polynomials, I want to make sure, like, have you learned this in school? Do we know X and Y? Um, what is a parabola? Like making sure that they have a baseline understanding before we dive in. And if they don't, we'll take a step back first. Distributed study is important. So my goal as a coach would be, let's start meeting 30 minutes once a week and let's spread that out to 30 minutes every 2 weeks and then 30 minutes once a month. And then boom, you actually have this down. You don't need me anymore. And then visual and auditory. So, like we're doing now, I'm speaking, we've got the slides. I'd always share my screen during a session. If we're talking about, downloading an app, it's like, here, let's go to the website. Let's click through it, right? We're talking about a math question. Let's make sure you get the verbal like affirmation you understand, but also draw it out, solve it together. And sometimes having the student do that work is more helpful and generally more productive. Chunk, chew, and check is another method. I mean, it's like learning, then you got to chew on it for a bit, but then you got to make sure you remember it. So we want to rehearse the information right after learning it, but then again within 24 hours, that'll help us cement it down the road. Writing things down could not be more important. Meaningful, structured way. So even if that's just my assignments, having it really in a nice order. Right. I noticed this week, again, at the hospital, some of the nurses were a little bit all amazing for the record, but some a little bit scattered and kind of didn't know exactly when everything was due. Some write it out right away. All right, this is due at 11, this is due at 2, this is due at 5, and then it's just easier and better for everyone. And then subsequent rounds down the road of forced retrieval practice in different environments. So you want to have a good dedicated study place, but sometimes we learn better if you shift. So if you're studying for finals and you're just in your room, it actually may be better to go to the library and then like try to recall that same information. Then you've learned it in 2 spots. Then on test day, you're going to retrieve it again. And then just last few, auditory processing issues. So students, a lot of times this is from birth and sometimes changes, throughout childhood, but making sure that we're facing the student and in close proximity. Don't want a ton of distracting sounds, obviously. Same as a student with English as a second language. We want to articulate clearly at a good but slow pace. Broken down directions that are clear and succinct. And then helping the student be a self-advocate. They can always ask questions and seek out help. Like I want to make sure that my students always know that. If you ever have any questions, right, this is a healthy place and a good place to ask them. It's also a safe spot to make mistakes. We'll both make them, we'll learn from them. Right, making sure they know that it's safe. For dyslexia, as I mentioned, the math challenges come up a lot where maybe just this word problem doesn't allow us to understand what's being asked. So breaking things into discrete steps and helping the student look at what is important and what is not. What do I need and what can I ignore? Then we break down every step, right? So what am I solving for? What do I know? What's our plan in detail? Another way we can help is reviewing previously taught concepts again and again, right? So for SAT, we're doing a lot of that. Coming back, make sure that vertex form has stuck with you. Can we do this question? And try it out. All right, last thing here, high-level takeaways. Every person, every brain is different. There's no one cookie cutter approach to teaching or coaching for anyone, but especially for students with learning differences. Our job as a support person, again, whether that's a peer or if it's myself who has the learning difference, or if it's a parent or a teacher or an administrator, your job is to be super positive, reinforcing, and affirming. If you're looking to build self-efficacy for the student with an LD, one individual score or grade is not as important as just the self-concept and belief in yourself. The successes will come if you have that. So in that vein, you got to be flexible, got to be responsive, so creative. So it's adaptability, really. If you're working with students with LDs, and trust in the fact that they know themselves, you can help them understand themselves better. We'll emphasize strategic problem solving. Make sure the student knows that they're the star. I'm not trying to like be a guru. I'm just trying to help you achieve your goals. And you're going to have this sense of agency when we're done. And then just thinking about what accommodations do we have, helping them work skillfully with those, but also knowing when and how to ask for help and whom to ask. All right, we are done today. We're gonna launch another quick poll and then open it up for questions. Questions don't occur to you tonight, you can always email this address below or call and talk to someone in the office. Many of our people who work in client services have been tutors in the past, but all really know their stuff. And yeah, if you anyone who doesn't have questions, right, if you're satisfied, hope that today was helpful and feel free to take off, but I'm gonna leave it open just for another few minutes. Leave it open for just another 20, 30 seconds, see if any questions pop up. Thank you guys for joining tonight. Oh, here's a question. So this is with a student who is severely behind and has super low esteem, so like super low self-esteem, right? Which kind of goes hand in hand. If you feel like you're falling behind and you've got friends and people who are feeling like they're succeeding more easily, the question here is, where do you even begin? And I would say the same place we always have to begin, which is just like the conversation. So breaking it down, is it a certain class? If it's every class, right, then that's a different story. But let's start with what do you feel like you're best at, right? What's your strength? If we're not doing well in, let's say, history, which is our favorite, then that'd be something that I want to start with. So we like history, right? The teacher's good. So where am I lacking? Then the next step might be, let's go to the teacher and let's talk about that a little bit, right? Or just self-reflect. So I think it's breaking it down and again, being curious and just coming from a place of inquiry, but also not judgment. So, hey, clearly something's going on because like you are so bright and you have so many talents and you're so wonderful. So I just want to help you get to the bottom of why we're falling behind. And making it clear that it's not like, obviously it's hard not to take it to heart and have it affect your self-esteem, but that it's really not that, right? It's probably something different, right? And if you have a learning difference, which many, many people have, then our job is to figure out what will help, right? So set you up for success. It's a tough spot though, right? And it can be especially hard if it's your child, because like I mentioned, especially in high school, sometimes it's hard to really get them to hear what you're saying. All right, great question. And I really appreciate you guys all joining. Hope it was helpful. We're going to call it an evening. And again, reach out if you have any more questions to the email below here.